Hi, welcome to part two of this two-part episode on Louis Armstrong and his song Tight Like This. In the first part, we talked about Armstrong's musical education and his period working as a sideman in Chicago and New York. In this part, we'll have a look at what he was able to do once he had the center stage all to himself. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. Armstrong returned to Chicago, but he never really went back to what he'd been doing with King Oliver's band. From this point on, he would always be the featured soloist. For the next 2 years, he bounced between a few different bands and venues on the South Side, while also performing soundtracks for silent movies in the Vendome Movie Palace Orchestra. He grew more confident on stage during this time, started singing and developing his signature mugging stage persona. He also started to incorporate other musical interests into what he was doing, particularly opera, something that had fascinated him since he was first able to afford a record player and recordings of Enrico Caruso and Luisa Tetrazzini while still a teenager back in New Orleans. From the time of his return to Chicago, though, there's another side to Armstrong's career that is much better documented for us today. While still in New York, he had made arrangements with OK Records, allowing him to record pretty much whatever music he wanted, as long as they didn't have to pay royalties for it, with whatever musicians he wanted to play with, in exchange for being available to serve as an accompanist on records of various singers. He assembled a group that included his current boss, Lillian Harden, his former boss, trombonist Kid Ory, and several other older, more established musicians from his time in New Orleans. They went into the studio for the first time just a few days after his arrival. This was the Hot Five, which briefly became the Hot Seven in the spring of 1927 after the OK Studio switched to electronic recording. That allowed for the use of drums and tuba, both of which tended to make the needle jump in the old process. Under various names and in various incarnations, this group would go on to record what is the most influential body of jazz from the 1920s. But they only ever performed together as a live act one time. Each of them had their own gigs that kept them busy late into the evening, so they would gather in the studio early in the morning, sometimes recording as many as 6 tunes in a single session. This original incarnation of the group recorded tunes that were, as you might expect from such a group of New Orleans all-stars, still pretty rooted in the tradition, though with a few differences. They slowed things down a fair bit, allowing for more rhythmic variation and more expressive playing, although this could also be closer to the way bands like Oliver's played when they were on stage. They also took the collective improvisation, which had been the focus on Oliver's records, and shunted it to the beginning and ending of tracks, allowing the solos, particularly Armstrong solos, to take center stage. These changes may have been influenced to a certain extent by the blues singers Armstrong had started recording with while he was in New York. The influence of Lillian Harden, who worked with the group as a composer and arranger in addition to performing with them, probably also played a role. But it seems that Armstrong by this point had a specific direction in his mind, and it wouldn't be long before he took things even farther. His main partner in that next phase was the piano player Earl Hines. Hines was yet another classically trained pianist, but this time one with whom Armstrong could really see eye to eye musically. Armstrong was what was referred to as an eccentric player, meaning that, for the time anyway, he used a lot of spicy rhythms and harmonies in his solos. Hines, who would later serve as a mentor to several of the innovators of bebop, took things even farther in that direction. His solos from this era can be truly shocking in their dissonance and angularity, often descending into whirlwinds of chaos, only to snap back into a tight, urbane rhythm on a dime. Hines's playing is often referred to as trumpet-like, and I think what people mean by this more than anything else is simply that he used the piano as a melodic instrument. And probably no one is more responsible than Hines for liberating jazz piano, and the rhythm section in general, from that tedious functional role that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Armstrong and Hines first met in the pool room of their Union Local Hall, shortly after Armstrong returned to Chicago. They immediately hit it off, and soon after, when Armstrong was beginning to chafe at having his wife as his boss, Hines convinced him to join him in a band being led by violinist Carol Dickerson at the nearby Sunset Cafe. For the next 2 years or so, Armstrong, Hines, and their third musketeer, drummer Suddy Singleton, were nearly inseparable. They even kept an apartment together, on top of the house that Louis owned along with Lillian. All this led up to the summer of 1928, when Armstrong entered the studio for the first time with a completely new version of the Hot Five, including Hines, Singleton, and several other members of Dickerson's group. It must have been difficult for someone who prioritized loyalty as much as Armstrong did to let go of the original Hot Five, particularly Hardin, who did continue working with them as a composer. But the 19 songs that this new Hot Five recorded together make it very clear that Armstrong was ready and eager for a completely new direction at this point. The second Hot Five, which very often recorded under the name the Savoy Ballroom Five after the venue most of them were playing in at the time, was a completely different kind of animal. Their songs tend to have a tightly arranged sonic quality, which contrasts with the off-the-cuff vibe of the original group. There are also far fewer references to collective improvisation, and those that are there sound hyper-stylized, not like they're trying to convince you it's the real thing at all. The affection between Armstrong and Hines is also prominently displayed, and can be heard both in humorous spoken interludes like on the hilarious song A Monday Date, and in their musical interactions, good examples of which are Skip the Gutter and Weatherbird, the only song the two ever recorded all by themselves. Sadly, this incredible musical combination existed for less than 6 months until the whole group went their separate ways around the end of 1928. In December, when they made about half of their recordings, they were joined by Don Redman, who had befriended Armstrong during his time in New York and came to bring the group some arrangements and to play along on clarinet. In addition to his own stuff, Redman brought a tune by Langston Curl, the trumpet player of his unfortunately named group McKinney's Cotton Pickers. The tune was a play on one of the biggest songs of 1928, a high-energy blues full of sexual double entendres called It's Tight Like That, by pianist Georgia Tom Dorsey, who went on to become one of the biggest names in the history of gospel music, and slide guitarist Tampa Red. This song was so popular that a whole new genre called hokum was created to emulate it. So, of course, a lot of groups recorded cover versions of it, including McKinney's Cotton Pickers. Curl's song was tight like this. Exactly how it's supposed to be related to It's Tight Like That, other than the title, is a bit unclear. Armstrong's version is so distinctive that it likely bears little resemblance to what Redman originally brought. And since no one recorded a version before Armstrong left his mark on it, it's possible that this will remain a mystery. Whatever it was they started with, what they turned it into has a misleadingly conventional beginning. Armstrong opens with a brief fanfare, basically a much less ambitious version of what he had already done to open several songs, most notably West End Blues, which they had recorded back in June. Then someone, most likely Earl Hines, doing what I guess you would call a girly voice, chimes in with the comment, "Oh, it's tight like that." After some brief comedic banter with Armstrong, the song then begins in earnest with a straightforward run-through of the chorus in a faux New Orleans style. A minor key lends a tense, almost spooky feeling to the tune, which made me wonder if maybe they were trying to evoke a funeral when I first heard it. This must have been a vibe that they were into at the time, because they did something very similar on St. James Infirmary, a song that may be the evolution of an 18th century British ballad, which they recorded that same day. The second chorus, featuring Hines' piano with only minimal drum accompaniment, is extraordinary in its own right. Hines extemporizes freely throughout, with only passing references to the tune we've just heard. In typical fashion, he swings wildly between moods, one moment descending into a frenetic cascade of notes that makes you think he's completely lost track of the song, or maybe tripped and fallen onto his keyboard. The next, snapping effortlessly back into a rhythm so light and snazzy that you wonder if what you just heard really happened at all. Through all this, though, it's clear that Hines understands that he's not the main event here. His solo functions a bit like a hype man speech, building the audience's excitement for what everyone knows is about to happen. Then everything suddenly changes. The full band re-enters, but in the most minimal way possible, just playing sustained notes, alternating between two chords at 2-bar intervals over a simple pulse in the drums and piano. This is remarkably similar to an effect in Italian opera called the big guitar, in which the entire orchestra acts like, well, a big guitar, in order to get out of the singer's way, which, of course, is also what's happening here. Earlier I mentioned Armstrong's youthful fascination with opera. Since those days, hunched over his first record player, he'd had a lot of opportunity to engage with operatic and other classical music, in lessons, in theater orchestras, and even in nightclubs. So it's fair to say that this was something he was pretty familiar with by this point. Listening to someone like Caruso sing an aria, I can imagine Armstrong being hit with a twinge of envy, just at the platform for the display of power, virtuosity, and musical rhetoric that kind of music gives a performer. Mind you, I have absolutely no evidence that anything in Tight Like This was in any way consciously inspired by opera. It probably wasn't, but it is definitely operatic, and it gives Armstrong the opportunity to work with the kind of musical drama that pops up sometimes in popular music, but is very rare in jazz. Armstrong's solo stretches across 3 16-bar choruses, interspersed with some words of encouragement from whoever it is doing that girly voice. With each chorus, the rhythm gets a little more energetic and the pitch gets a little higher, and this adds a kind of story quality to the whole experience. He starts off in an incredibly understated way, just playing a simple, rising 2-note figure that sounds to me like the cautious hello of someone entering a dark and scary house. He then plays that same figure 2 more times, only to apparently lose confidence and fall back down to a point even lower than where he started. The timidity of this opening is totally out of character for Armstrong, and the fact that he's clearly doing some acting here introduces that narrative quality and sets up the kind of story that we're about to witness. He begins the second phrase in the same way, but this time seems to find his voice and succeeds in making something a little bit more exciting out of it, only to fall back down again, but not quite as far as the first time. This rising and falling continues throughout the chorus, each time adding a little bit more rhythmic energy and reaching a slightly higher pitch. This kind of sawtooth pattern is actually something that's pretty typical in blues, and something Armstrong had used many times before this point. But the kind of drama that he's able to milk from it here is something that would really be more associated with blues singers like Bessie Smith, for whom Armstrong had served as an accompanist several times by this point. At the beginning of the second chorus, the full band joins in pulsing with the drums and piano, adding more rhythmic energy. Armstrong enters with another sawtooth, this one loosely outlining the beginning of the famous There's a Place in France melody, a tune that had already been extremely well known even before it was included in the musical Showboat the previous year. Bum ba bum 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 bum. This quotation seems to happen by accident, which may or may not be more acting, but either way, Armstrong catches on and doubles down on it in the second phrase. Bum ba bum 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 bum. This infusion of comedy seems to be just what he needs to boost his confidence, because he begins the third phrase by for the first time displaying the incredible power and force that was one of the trademarks of his style. Bum 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 bum. He spends most of the second half of the chorus locked into a rolling, syncopated rhythmic figure that's the most idiomatic thing he's played so far, and makes it pretty clear that the timidity we heard earlier is now a thing of the past. All this sets the stage for the final chorus, in which Armstrong completes his performed run of the emotional gamut with a display of sheer cockiness. Armstrong spends the final 16 bars just basically pounding on some of the highest notes his instrument could produce, with relatively little subtlety, but with overwhelming power. This was also one of the trademarks of his stage performances. But in this context, it comes across as so incredibly majestic that when Hines, or whoever it is, chimes in for a last bit of encouragement at the end, he sounds a bit shaken and seems to have completely forgotten about his girly voice shtick. One interpretation of all this is that it's an elaborate sexual simulation, which is the argument put forward by Thomas Brothers, who I mentioned earlier. I would guess that this is probably true of whatever it is Don Redman originally brought into the studio that day, given the context of It's Tight Like That, which is definitely all about sex. Elements of that origin definitely survive in what we hear, especially in the girly voice interludes and in Armstrong's final display, which could certainly be described as orgasmic. Those aspects are there, but what Armstrong makes of it strikes me as entirely too rhetorical and structured for that to be the whole story. Despite having been obsessed with this song for a very long time, I have to admit that I don't really know what Armstrong and his friends were getting at. But I would suggest that one possible alternative is that this is not so much a song about sex as it's a song about men bonding with one another about sex. Looking at it this way could help to explain the curious mix of goofy humor and apparently sincere emotion, and the journey of Armstrong, the storyteller, from timidity to brazen confidence, with a little help from his friends. The musical quotation of a tune traditionally associated with risque entertainment for a male audience would also make a lot of sense with this interpretation. Maybe most significant is the fact that we are actually listening to a group of men who apparently had great affection for one another, bonding, as it turned out for the very last time in this context. It's not clear whether or not Armstrong and his friends knew that they would never be in the studio together again, or that within a few short months Armstrong would be in a Broadway theater, performing Fats Waller and Andy Razaf's Ain't Misbehavin', the song that brought him to the attention of white audiences and irrevocably put his career on a completely new and different path. Whether or not they did, Tight Like This serves as an incredible commemoration of the 6 years that had passed since Armstrong first arrived in Chicago, and to the incredible evolution he had undergone, from the timid apprentice who recorded his first solo in Chimes Blues, to the supremely confident and capable musician who, at the end of 1928, stood ready to take on the world.